October 14, 1943. The morning was cold, dark, and foggy across the airfields of East Anglia, England. More than 3,000 American airmen climbed into their B-17 Flying Fortress bombers before dawn. They pulled on heavy flight suits and boots designed for the brutal cold at high altitude. They sat through briefings covering weather, enemy flak positions, fighter opposition, and fuel calculations. Then they looked at the map, and saw where they were going. Schweinfurt, Germany. The announcement of Schweinfurt as the day's target produced a chorus of groans from every briefing room in England. They had been there before. In August, 60 American bombers had been shot down attacking the same city. It had taken 3 full months to rebuild the 8th Air Force to a strength capable of going back. Now they were going back. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off into the grey English morning. Each bomber carried a crew of 10 men. Each man knew the statistics. At that loss rate, a bomber crew member assigned to the 8th Air Force in 1943 would not, statistically, survive his required 25-mission combat tour. By the end of that single day, October 14, 1943, 60 bombers would be shot down. Another 17 would crash on landing or be declared beyond repair. 121 more would return with serious damage. More than 600 American airmen would be killed, wounded, or captured. The day would go down in history as Black Thursday, the greatest single-day disaster in the history of American air power. And it happened for one reason. The American bombers had no fighter escort capable of staying with them all the way to the target and back. That problem was about to be solved. And the solution would destroy the Luftwaffe forever. Welcome to WW2 Clandestine. The classified files are open. To understand the full impact of what was coming, you need to understand exactly how dominant the German Luftwaffe was in the skies over Europe in 1943. Germany had entered the war with the most combat-experienced air force in the world. While Britain and France had largely stood down their air forces through the 1930s, Germany had been secretly rebuilding and, crucially, testing its pilots in real combat during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. By the time World War II began, German fighter pilots had combat experience that no Allied pilot could match. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw 190 were two of the finest fighter aircraft of the era. Fast, agile, and flown by pilots who had been in continuous combat for years, they dominated every theater they entered. In the Battle of Britain in 1940, the RAF lost over 1,000 aircraft. In the first week of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Germany destroyed more than 1,800 Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground before they could even take off. The Luftwaffe had also developed devastatingly effective tactics against American bomber formations. German pilots discovered early on that attacking from the front, head-on at the nose of the bomber formation, was the most lethal approach. The B-17's nose had the weakest defensive armament, and a head-on attack gave the bomber gunners almost no time to react before the fighter had already passed through the formation. The Luftwaffe also deployed a calculated strategy of waiting. German fighter controllers tracked American bomber formations from the moment they crossed into German-controlled airspace. They watched and waited. They knew exactly how far the American escort fighters could fly before their fuel ran out and they had to turn back. The moment the escorts reached that point and banked for England, the German fighters descended on the unprotected bombers like wolves. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, the two primary American escort fighters of 1943, were both capable aircraft. But even with external drop tanks attached to carry additional fuel, they could barely reach the German border before turning back. Everything beyond that border was German hunting ground. The human cost of this tactical reality was catastrophic. The 8th Air Force's bomber units experienced a 77% overall casualty rate between 1942 and 1944. That number bears repeating, 77%. If you were assigned as a crew member to an 8th Air Force bomber in 1943, the statistical probability was that you would not complete your tour of duty alive or uninjured. On August 17, 1943, the first Schweinfurt raid, 60 of 376 American bombers were shot down. Almost all the losses came beyond the range of the escort fighters. On Black Thursday, October 14, 60 more bombers were lost in a single afternoon. Of the 2,900 crewmen who flew that day, 254 did not return. 65 survived as prisoners of war. The 305th Bomb Group alone lost 130 men, 87% of those who flew. One survivor, pilot Wally Hoffman of the 351st Bomb Group, described that morning, when he looked outside at the weather at pre-dawn, it was pitch black and very foggy. He thought there was no possibility they could take off in those conditions. They took off anyway. After Black Thursday, unescorted daylight bombing raids deep into Germany were suspended. The strategy that American commanders had built their entire air campaign around, the belief that large formations of heavily armed bombers could fight their way to targets without fighter escort, had been proven catastrophically wrong. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, knew that without a long-range escort fighter, the strategic bombing campaign was finished. He needed a fighter that could fly all the way to Berlin and back. Unknown to many of the men dying in those bombers, that fighter already existed. It had been sitting largely unused for 2 years, waiting for someone to unlock its true potential. The story of the P-51 Mustang begins not in America but in Britain, in the desperate spring of 1940. Germany's armies were rampaging across Europe. France was collapsing. Britain was fighting for survival. The Royal Air Force was burning through aircraft faster than British factories could replace them. The British government turned to American manufacturers for emergency help. They approached North American Aviation, a relatively young California company, and asked them to build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk under license for the RAF. The P-40 was an existing American fighter already in production. Building it under license would be straightforward. North American Aviation's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, had a different idea. He proposed that instead of spending time and money tooling up to build someone else's existing design, North American could design and build a completely new fighter from scratch, and deliver it faster than it would take to prepare for P-40 production. The British were skeptical. Building a prototype combat aircraft from scratch typically took years. North American was promising to do it in months. They delivered. The North American team, led by chief designer Edgar Schmud, worked with extraordinary speed and ingenuity. They incorporated the latest aerodynamic research from the National Advisory Committee on Aviation, including data on a revolutionary new wing design called the laminar flow wing. Unlike conventional wings, the laminar flow wing maintained smooth airflow over a much larger portion of its surface, dramatically reducing drag. The result was an aircraft with exceptional speed and range at low altitude. North American Aviation delivered the prototype in just 102 days from the signing of the British contract. The aircraft first flew on October 26, 1940. The British accepted it into service and gave it its famous name, the Mustang. By any measure, the early Mustang was an impressive aircraft. It was fast at low and medium altitudes. Its laminar flow wing gave it exceptional range. Its innovative radiator cooling system contributed to its sleek, low-drag profile. The British loved it. But there was one serious problem that limited the early Mustang's combat value. The Allison V1710 engine that powered the early Mustang performed well up to about 15,000 feet. Above that altitude, performance fell off sharply. The engine supercharger, the device that forced air into the engine at high altitude where the air is thin, was not powerful enough for high-altitude combat. This mattered enormously. The air war over Germany was being fought at 20,000 to 30,000 feet. At those altitudes, the early Allison-powered Mustang simply could not compete with the Bf-109 and the FW-190. So the early Mustang served in secondary roles: ground attack, tactical reconnaissance, low-level operations. Valuable work, but far from the decisive weapon that the Allies desperately needed. For 2 years, as the bomber crews of the 8th Air Force bled over Germany, the Mustang sat on the sidelines. Then a British test pilot had an idea that would change the entire course of the war. In the fall of 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Hawker flew the Mustang and immediately recognized what he was dealing with. The airframe was outstanding, light, agile, beautifully designed. The problem was entirely the engine. Hawker knew the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine well. It was the power plant of the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Lancaster bomber, the beating heart of British air power. And he had a thought. What if you put the Merlin into the Mustang's airframe? The British fitted 5 test Mustangs with the Merlin 61 engine. The results were nothing short of astounding. With the Merlin engine installed, the Mustang reached speeds in excess of 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison-powered version at the same altitude. The crippling high-altitude performance problem was completely and instantly solved. The aircraft that had been mediocre above 15,000 feet was suddenly dominant above 20,000 feet, exactly where the air war over Germany was being fought. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the American military attaché in London, monitored these British tests closely and immediately understood their significance. Hitchcock was a remarkable figure. At 17 years old he had served with the French Lafayette Flying Corps in World War I, been shot down and captured by the Germans, escaped by jumping from a moving train, and walked more than 100 miles to safety in Switzerland. After the war he became one of the most celebrated polo players in America, moved in literary circles that included F. Scott Fitzgerald, who reportedly based the character Tom Buchanan in The Great Gatsby loosely on Hitchcock, and lived as a wealthy socialite before returning to military service when World War II began. Now, in the fall of 1942, Hitchcock sent an urgent report to Washington recommending immediate development of the Merlin-powered Mustang as a high-altitude fighter. The recommendation was acted upon with unusual speed. The Merlin engine was already being manufactured under license in the United States by the Packard Motor Car Company, designated the Packard V1650. North American Aviation was directed to redesign the Mustang around this engine. By the summer of 1943, Merlin-powered P-51Bs were coming off North American's assembly line. The specifications of the new aircraft were remarkable. Top speed, 440 miles per hour. 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. With jettisonable external drop tanks, large teardrop-shaped fuel tanks that could be dropped when empty or when combat began, the P-51 had an operational range of more than 1,600 miles. It could fly from England to Berlin and back with fuel to spare for combat. For the first time in the entire war, the Allies had a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to the deepest targets inside Germany. But the story has a tragic dimension. Thomas Hitchcock, the man who had done more than almost anyone to get the Merlin-powered Mustang into production, who had championed the aircraft at a time when Washington was slow to act, did not live to see the full impact of what he had set in motion. On April 18, 1944, Hitchcock was test-flying a Mustang near Salisbury, England, investigating a problem with the external wing tanks. The added weight of the fuel tanks had a tendency to destabilize the aircraft in a high-speed dive. Hitchcock insisted on investigating the problem himself rather than risking the lives of his test pilots. He was unable to pull his Mustang out of the dive. He died in the subsequent crash. 2 months later, only 2 German aircraft appeared over the Normandy invasion beaches. Thomas Hitchcock never saw that moment. In mid-December 1943, the first Merlin-powered P-51s arrived in England and flew their first long-range bomber escort missions over Germany. The reaction from pilots who transitioned from the P-47 Thunderbolt to the P-51 was initially skeptical. P-47 pilots loved their aircraft. It was a massive, powerful machine, nearly twice the weight of the Mustang, with a reputation for being able to absorb tremendous punishment and still bring its pilot home. The Mustang was lighter, more delicate feeling. Many pilots were uncertain. As the Imperial War Museum records show, that skepticism dissolved quickly once pilots experienced the Mustang in combat. It was faster than the P-47 above 20,000 feet. It was more maneuverable in a turning fight. And with its drop tanks, it simply went places the P-47 could not reach. The 357th Fighter Group was the first P-51 unit assigned to the 8th Air Force. They arrived in England in November 1943 and flew their first combat mission in February 1944. Among the pilots of the 357th was a young man named Bud Anderson, who would go on to score 16.25 aerial victories in the Mustang across 116 combat missions and 480 hours of combat flying. His wingman on many of those missions was another young pilot named Chuck Yeager, who 3 years after the war ended would become the first human being to break the sound barrier. Yeager scored 12.5 aerial victories in the P-51. These were not unusual men in the context of the 8th Air Force's Mustang pilots. The aircraft seemed to produce aces. It gave skilled pilots the tools they needed to do what they had always been capable of doing. For bomber crews, the arrival of the Mustang meant something profoundly emotional as well as tactical. They called their fighter escorts their little friends, a nickname that captures everything about what it meant to look out the window of a B-17 over Germany and see those silver aircraft flying alongside you. Before the Mustang, bomber crews had watched their escorts turn for home at the German border, knowing what came next. With the Mustang, that moment never arrived. American commanders also changed tactics to maximize the Mustang's effect. Previously, escort fighters had been ordered to stay close to the bomber formations at all times, a conservative approach that protected individual bombers but gave the Luftwaffe the freedom to choose when and where to engage. Now the orders changed. Once Allied bombers were attacked, P-51 pilots had explicit permission to break formation and pursue German fighters aggressively. The stated goal was direct: destroy as many Luftwaffe aircraft as possible. Not just protect the bombers. Hunt down the German fighters wherever they went. Chase them back to their airfields. Attack them on the ground. Give them no safe place anywhere. On their way back from escort missions, Mustang pilots also attacked targets of opportunity, enemy trucks, trains, barges, and airfields. The Luftwaffe could no longer simply land and regroup. Nowhere was safe. The full test of the new strategy came during what Allied commanders called Big Week. February 20th to 25th, 1944. Allied planners launched Operation Argument, a concentrated week-long bombing offensive targeting German fighter aircraft production facilities across the Reich. The strategy was ambitious and calculated. The goal was not simply to destroy factories. It was to force the Luftwaffe into the air in large numbers to defend those factories, and then destroy the Luftwaffe in the air faster than Germany could replace its pilots and aircraft. The logic was sound. Germany had spent years building up a cadre of highly experienced fighter pilots. These men were irreplaceable. Each one represented years of training and combat experience. If you could kill enough of them in a short enough time, the Luftwaffe would collapse not from lack of aircraft. Germany was still producing planes in large numbers, but from lack of the experienced men needed to fly them effectively. Big Week worked with devastating precision. During those 6 days of concentrated combat in February 1944, Mustang pilots destroyed 17% of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilots in air-to-air combat. 17% of Germany's most experienced fighter pilots, men who had been flying combat since 1939 and 1940, killed in less than 1 week. The shift in the strategic situation was immediately visible in the bomber loss statistics. In October 1943, before the Mustang's arrival, 9.1% of 8th Air Force bomber sorties had failed to return, and 45.6% had been damaged. By February 1944, the failure to return rate had dropped to 3.5%. Damage fell to 29.9%. The same bombers flying the same routes into the same targets were suddenly coming home in dramatically larger numbers. The reason was the Mustang. The bombers had not changed. The targets had not changed. The German defenses had not fundamentally changed. What had changed was the fighter flying alongside the bombers, the fighter that no longer turned back at the German border. March 6, 1944. For the first time in the history of the war, American bombers attacked Berlin in a major daytime raid. More than 800 U.S. bombers, escorted by more than 900 fighters including large numbers of P-51 Mustangs, flew directly to the German capital in broad daylight. The psychological impact on the German high command was profound. Berlin had always seemed untouchable, too far inside Germany for any escort fighter to reach. Every previous American attempt at deep penetration bombing had proven the point. Without escort, bombers died. With escort, fighters ran out of fuel before reaching the deepest targets. Now American fighters were over Berlin. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, reportedly said when he saw Mustangs over Berlin that he knew the war was lost. Whether or not those were his precise words, the historical record of what the Imperial War Museum preserves makes the sentiment clear. The appearance of long-range American fighters over the German capital represented a shift that the Luftwaffe could not reverse. German pilot Günther Schack experienced this new reality firsthand on August 6, 1944, at a Luftwaffe base in East Prussia. His squadron of 9 Messerschmitt Bf 109s scrambled to intercept what they believed was a Soviet bomber formation. As they closed on their targets, Schack realized something was wrong. These were not Soviet aircraft. They were American B-17s, flying toward a base inside the Soviet Union as part of a shuttle bombing operation. As Schack led his planes into the attack, P-51D Mustangs came roaring out of the sun, 6.50 caliber machine guns blazing from each aircraft. The German pilots had been completely surprised. The Mustangs had appeared from nowhere, with a range and reach the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. For 40 years after the war, Schack would wonder why one American pilot, who had the kill shot and clearly had Schack dead in his sights, had only waved and let him go. He never learned the answer. No story of the P-51 Mustang is complete without the story of the men who flew it into combat with red-painted tails, the Tuskegee Airmen. Between 1941 and 1946, roughly 1,000 African American pilots were trained at a segregated air base in Tuskegee, Alabama. They did this at a time when African Americans were still subject to Jim Crow laws across much of the United States, and when the American military itself was racially segregated. Many within the military establishment expected, and in some cases hoped, that the Tuskegee experiment would fail, providing justification for continued exclusion of black Americans from combat aviation. The Tuskegee Airmen refused to fail. The most famous unit was the 332nd Fighter Group, for squadrons of African American pilots who flew with the distinctive red-painted tails on their P-51 Mustangs, earning them the nickname the Red Tails. They flew more than 15,000 sorties as bomber escorts and lost 66 men in the line of duty. White bomber crews who flew with the Red Tails noticed something. Their bombers came home. The 332nd Fighter Group developed a reputation as among the most reliable escort units in the entire 8th and 15th Air Forces. While other fighter groups sometimes broke off to pursue individual aerial victories, which boosted personal kill scores but left the bombers temporarily vulnerable, the Red Tails maintained discipline and stayed with their bombers. Their combat record was exceptional. They destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and another 150 on the ground. They damaged 148 more. They even shot down 3 Messerschmitt Me-262s, Germany's revolutionary jet fighter, which was faster than any propeller-driven aircraft the Allies had. They destroyed 950 enemy vehicles including more than 600 railway wagons. After white pilots specifically requested the Tuskegee Airmen to escort them, their commanding officer Colonel B.O. Davis named his personal aircraft by request, in honor of that recognition. In 2007, more than 350 Tuskegee Airmen and their widows were awarded a collective Congressional Gold Medal by the United States Congress, one of the highest civilian honors the nation can bestow. The Tuskegee Airmen fought 2 wars simultaneously, one against the Luftwaffe over Europe, and one against racial segregation and discrimination in their own country. They won both. By the spring of 1944, historians agree that the back of the German Luftwaffe had been broken. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. By the end of the war, P-51 Mustang pilots had destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum records that the Mustang facilitated a change in tactics that gave the 8th and 15th Air Forces complete superiority in the skies over Europe. Germany faced an impossible equation. It was losing experienced pilots faster than it could train replacements. The men being killed were not raw recruits, they were veteran aces with years of combat experience. Germany had no way to rapidly produce pilots of equivalent skill. Even as German aircraft factories continued producing planes in significant numbers, there were increasingly not enough qualified pilots to fly them effectively. At the same time, Allied bombing of German fuel production facilities was beginning to have devastating effects. Without aviation fuel, even the experienced pilots who survived could not fly. The combined effect was total air superiority for the Allies. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Normandy invasion, only 2 German aircraft appeared over the beaches. The most powerful air force the world had ever seen, the force that had dominated European skies from Norway to North Africa, had been reduced to near total impotence. By the end of the war in Europe, 15 of the 16 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force Fighter Command had converted to the P-51 Mustang. The one group that retained its P-47 Thunderbolts, the 56th Fighter Group, did so largely out of pride and loyalty to the aircraft that had carried them through the worst of the 1943 Air War. Every other group had drawn the same conclusion independently: the Mustang was the finest fighter available. In total, approximately 14,000 Mustangs were built during World War II. Of those, 8,032 were the definitive P-51D model with its distinctive bubble canopy, more than all other variants combined. Each P-51D cost $51,572 in 1944 values, less than many of the bombers it protected. Behind every statistic in this story were real human beings whose lives were defined by these events. The bomber crews who flew Black Thursday, men like pilot David Palmer of the 351st Bomb Group, 20 years old, struggling to keep his B-17 called the Duchess straight and level through the flak over Schweinfurt while engine number 3 burned. These men represent the human reality of what the P-51 Mustang ultimately saved. Palmer survived that day. Hundreds of his fellow airmen did not. For Lieutenant Hug Hell, flying only his 5th combat mission on Black Thursday, rockets hit his bomber's left wing with enough force that his aircraft commander gave the bailout order. All 10 crew members parachuted into enemy territory and were captured almost immediately. Miraculously, every one of them survived captivity and the war. The 305th Bomb Group lost 130 men on that single day, 87% of everyone who flew. The 306th Bomb Group lost 100 men, with 35 killed on the mission or dying of wounds and 65 captured. These were the men the P-51 Mustang was built to protect. And from February 1944 onward, it protected them. Bud Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions in the Mustang and survived the war to become America's only living triple ace at the time of writing, described the Mustang's superiority as coming from a combination of factors that had never been brought together in a single aircraft before: the revolutionary laminar flow wing, the drag-reducing radiator cooling system, sufficient fuel for any mission, and the Merlin engine's extraordinary performance at every altitude. The P-51 was not designed to be a war-winning weapon. It was designed quickly in response to a British contract requirement, built in 102 days, and found its true purpose almost by accident when a British test pilot had the insight to swap one engine for another. From that moment, everything changed. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany divides cleanly into two distinct phases. Before the P-51 Mustang, the Allies were losing. Bomber crews flew toward Germany knowing the statistics were against their survival. The greatest air force America had ever built was being bled to death mission by mission over targets it could reach but not adequately protect. After the P-51 Mustang, the Allies held complete air superiority over Europe. The bombers reached their targets. The invasion of Normandy succeeded. The road to Berlin was opened. Jeremy Kinney of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum stated it directly: the P-51 was a war-winning weapon. As a fighter escort, it enabled the successful bombing of targets deep in Nazi Germany. It facilitated a change in tactics that gave American air forces superiority in the skies over Europe. And that superiority was the essential prerequisite for everything that followed: D-Day, the liberation of Western Europe, and the final defeat of Nazi Germany. With its bubble canopy and aerodynamic elegance, the P-51D is often described as the missing link between World War II propeller fighters and the jet aircraft that followed. It represented the absolute peak of what piston-engine fighter design could achieve. 102 days to build the prototype. 2 years waiting in the shadows with the wrong engine. 1 British test pilot's insight. 1 American colonel's urgent report to Washington. A Packard-built engine originally designed in Derby, England. And a generation of young men, from California and Alabama, from Chicago and Tuskegee, from small towns and big cities, black and white, who climbed into the cockpits of these silver aircraft and went hunting over the Reich. They broke the Luftwaffe. They opened the road to Berlin. They changed the course of the war. That is the real story of the P-51 Mustang. If this file was worth opening, subscribe to WW2 Clandestine. Every week we declassify another story history buried. The next file is already waiting.